China is all over the news. For example, last week, after 40 years, Amnesty International is leaving Hong Kong because of the new security law. The threats of China to Taiwan, or for example, the gigantic problems of real estate concern Evergrande and others, and it's dangerous for the world economy. Because I think it's clear that China is a superpower and a very big economical power. It is the European Union largest trading partner. It is very, very ambitious. And with the Belt and Road Initiative, or the new Silk Road, so to say, China is rapidly expanding its influence. I'm very pleased that Frank Pieke is here to shine a light on this enormous country and all the things happening. He will first give us a look at the internal power structures. For example, what is the role of the Chinese Communist Party? And is this changing? And with this in mind, Professor Pieke will elaborate on the geopolitical consequences of Xi Jinping's strategy. Frank Pieke is Professor of Modern Studies at the Leiden University, and he was the founding director of the Oxford China Center, and both director of Leiden University Institute of Area Studies and Leiden Asia Center. This academic year, he's a fellow at the Swedish Collegium for Advanced Studies in Uppsala, where he just recently came from, and he is author of several books, which among others, The Good Communist and Knowing China, a 21st Century Guide. Please, a very warm welcome for Professor Frank Pieke.
Right, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. It's almost impossible not to disappoint after that, I would think. But I'll do my best to say a few things that you might find interesting. By the way, I can't see you at all because there's light shining in my face, so I'm talking to a black wall, which is really weird. So as said, what I would like to do is talk about, first of all, China's political structure and also the relationship between the Chinese administration and society, which isn't as straightforward as you might think it is. And indeed then talk more about China's growing, not quite superpower status yet, and what that means for us, and what we should do, or perhaps also should not do. Question really is there anything that should be done, or is there anything that can be done? But most of the time, actually, I will be talking about China itself, which is my area of expertise. But I also will draw on very recent research that I've done and currently still doing here in the Netherlands on China's influence among the overseas Chinese communities here in the Netherlands, and also amongst Chinese businesses, Chinese invested companies here in the Netherlands. So I'll have also something to say about what China means to us here in this small but important part of Europe. One thing I would like to say before I get started, and that is that we live in a time where taking a stance, having an opinion, quite often trumps research, or trumps knowledge, or trumps trying to understand. And China is one of these topics where everybody has an opinion on, but many people talk about it without knowing really what's going on. I will do the opposite. I will tell you what I know, and actually, in a sense, my opinion is not that important. You know, what do I think about the situation of the Uyghurs is not interesting. You know, I'm just one person. But I can tell you how the situation of the Uyghurs fits or doesn't fit in the way that Chinese society is managed. So don't constantly ask me for taking a political stance. I do that, I'm happy to do that, but that's not the point, I think, of this talk today. I mean, then you would be wasting your time because you're just asking one individual about his opinion, and I think we can spend our time better than that. So, the Chinese Communist Party is something I've been working on for, let's see, about 40 years. Doing research in China about it, but also outside of China increasingly. And it's an organization that, just like China as a whole, when you say something about it, you say it is like this, then the opposite is almost immediately also true. So whatever you say, the opposite is also there. And the question is not so much, is it this or is it that, but rather, when is it this and when is it something else? So what conditions specific responses or specific actions of the Communist Party in which particular circumstances? So, in other words, it's really hard to pin it down on one particular trait or one particular characteristic, because it is just so many different things at the same time. It is, for instance, at least formally, revolutionary party, but it's also a organization that sits on top of one of the largest bureaucracies in the world. And that's actually a contradiction, right? And both of them are true. So trying to understand what the Chinese Communist Party is not an easy matter, but it's probably best to start with understanding that the Chinese Communist Party is both you could say, a parallel government. So you have the government, as we have it in the Netherlands as well, the state, we usually say in the Chinese context. But the party is there as well, and it duplicates the organizational structure of the government to a very large extent. So that's one side of the party, but the other side is just as important, and that is the party is currently 95 million members of the party. And 95 people is a lot, right? It's larger than the largest European country. But in the overall Chinese context, it's just 6.5%, 7% or something like that. But these 95 million members are a side to the Chinese Communist Party, which is just as important as the organizational side, the administrative side that I mentioned. So let's start with the first aspect, the administration. So the Chinese Communist Party, as I said, has a structure which parallels that of the state, of the government, but it operates, as it were, behind the scenes. So the state does the day-to-day running of the country, but the Communist Party tells it what to do, and why to do things and how to do things. But it doesn't really do very much, at least until recently it didn't do very much itself. So the Communist Party at each level of the administration, and there are 5 in China, has its own departments, you can say at the national level, the central level, ministries that coordinate the work of a whole bunch of other ministries and departments of the state, of the government. But as I said, they don't do very much themselves, these departments, but they tell the state what to do. But the point is that the party doesn't just tell the state what to do. The party controls all aspects of the administration and of social, political, and economic and cultural life. So to the party, and that is a fundamental point, Chinese society as a whole, you could think of as a chessboard. And on that chessboard, and the Communist Party is one of the players. Actually, it's the only player. It's the only chess game in the world where there's just one player. And he plays with just the white pieces, you can say, or the black pieces. But that player controls the state and its many different organizations and its many different departments, but it also controls the army, which is separate from the state as such. It also controls the judicial apparatus, so the courts, the district attorney system, and so on and so forth. That is also controlled by the Communist Party. The Communist Party also controls the organs of representative government, i.e. the parliaments. China has 2 parliaments, just like we. They're a little different from what we have, obviously. And for starters, they're much bigger. But at the end of the day, they are controlled by the Communist Party in very specific ways. And the state also controls, of course, state-owned enterprise, so a very large chunk of the economy. It owns the businesses, the largest businesses in China, and as such, it has a very important say in how the economy works. The state also controls, for instance, the financial system, so the most important banks are party-controlled. So the party is everywhere, right? If you want to understand China, this is the one thing, the party is everywhere and controls everything, or wants to control everything. But what it doesn't want to do is have total control. So the party understands as nobody else, I think, that if and when you try to control everything, you end up controlling nothing. And this is not a theoretical premise that I've sort of gotten from books, but this is something they've learned from hard experience. They tried in the 1960s and 1950s, they tried to control everything. Mao Zedong tried to do that. And in the process, he destroyed not only the state, but even almost destroyed the whole party itself. So the party has said that never again. You know, we can't have a party that wants to control each and every minutiae of social, political, economic, cultural life. We have to pick and choose. We have to say what is important to us and what's not important. And we have to let things go if they're not strategically absolutely essential. So that is really the reforms in a nutshell after 1978. After 1978, they said, you know, we can't really control everything. In fact, we don't want to control everything, but we do want to control the things that really matter. And the other things, we let go. But we also keep an eye on it, right? We never let it become fully independent, but it will become autonomous, and it has to sort of play its own role, find its own feet, develop according to its own logic. And the economy, of course, is a key example, the market economy. But you can make the same argument for other aspects of the social and political life, cultural life, for instance, social life, religious life, even if you want to. All these things have been let go to a certain extent, but always with the gaze of the party there to ensure that things don't get out of hand. So the party is everywhere. It can control everything if it wants to, but usually it is satisfied with just keeping an eye on things and just ensuring that things go roughly according to the playbook, and that things are not getting out, and particularly not that developments are directed against the party and its rule itself. That's, of course, the most important consideration. You don't want anything to happen that can threaten the rule of the party in China. China is not a one-party state, by the way, but the Communist Party, is the ruling party. And so there are another 8 democratic parties, but these are under the tutelage, as they say themselves, under the tutelage of the Communist Party. Likewise, as I said, the Communist Party controls the organs of representative government, so the 2 parliaments, and it does that mainly by, first of all, having a fairly hefty say in who gets elected or appointed in these parliaments, but also by controlling the party members amongst these delegates or these representatives on in these parliaments. So the key organization of the National People's Congress, let's say the second chamber, the lower house, whatever you want to call it, the House of Representatives, the key organization there is the party committee of the National People's Congress. So the National People's Congress consists of about 2,500 people, and the party committee consists of a few hundred people, a few hundred party members amongst them, and that really decides what's going on in the parliament, right? So that brings me to the other side of things, namely that the Communist Party is in charge, controls everything through its membership, right? So there's the formal organizations, and then there's the membership. And the membership, as I said, is everywhere. So it is in the parliament, obviously. There's, you know, when you have 95 million Communist Party members, there is going to be party members wherever you go, right? Each and every little company, each and every enterprise, each and every school, there will be party members there. And this is not a conspiracy. This is completely out in the open. Everybody knows who the party members are. The party secretary of the party committee of each and every organization is the #1 in charge. That is formally also said, right? The #1 in charge of each organization or company is the party secretary, who's the party secretary of the party committee, and the party committee is all the party members within that organization. And these party secretaries are then connected to party committees at higher levels, and this is how the party the formal structure that I was talking about earlier is connected with the membership in all social, economic and cultural organizations throughout society. And this web of committees and members joined up with the formal structure gives the party a reach wherever it wants to go. At least that is the theory, right? And the interesting thing about the current administration of Xi Jinping is that they're trying to make this a reality again. So during the reform process, the Communist Party, at least the first 20 years or so, the Communist Party actually let go of things, let go of the market, let go of the economy, let go of society. You looked at China in the 1990s, and I visited China in the 1990s a lot. It was what I always called the Wild East. Anything goes. It doesn't matter what you did, it didn't matter what you said or what you thought. Nobody cared. It was the freest society in the world. I swear to God it was. Nobody cared what happened. But then the Communist Party started to have second thoughts in the 2000s, or the new leadership in the Hu Jintao. And he thought, and the other leaders of his team thought, that things had gotten out of hand, that the Communist Party was losing control, that there were social groups that had emerged under reforms of entrepreneurs in particular, but also intellectuals or lawyers or artists. All these people had gotten a little too independent. And the task at hand was then how to rein them in or how to gain some more control over them without killing them off, right? So the idea was not that we want to apply put the full weight of the boot of the Communist Party on their neck again, but rather how do we ensure that they don't become instruments of protest, of even perhaps rebellion. And that was the fear, and that is why they took measures to try to avoid that. So then they started in earnest again, building up this network of party committees, of party members throughout society and linking that up much more firmly with the formal structure of the Communist Party. The Communist Party became also much more, let's say, ideological in its approach to Chinese society. So emphasis was again put on what really is Marxism, what is socialism, what are the core values of socialism. This is a term that's used all the time. What is it that the party should and could achieve in China, apart from just simply letting things play out? And this was the Hu Jintao era that ran from 2002 to 2012. And the current leader, Xi Jinping, who came to power in 2012, is basically doing the same thing, but he's doing it much better. He's doing it much more systematically. He is a much more powerful individual. And he has, much more than his predecessors, a really strong strategic look. So his predecessors lived in an era also when China had plenty of money to spend. The state was flush with money thanks to the success of the market economy. Taxes were rolling in, and the government and the party was dealing with problems simply by throwing a lot of money at it, which is a favorite game of most governments in the world, and the Chinese Communist Party is really no exception. But under Xi Jinping, that opulence came to an end. The revenues for the government did not grow as fast as they had in the past, so they had to pick and choose a little bit more. And Xi Jinping has been very smart at picking and choosing how to spend the money on what. So he spent money a lot on, for instance, generating more economic growth at all costs, because he knew that that would be the measure of his success come the end of his second term in office, which ends next year. So lots of money, lots of credit was used for that. Much less money was spent on other things that, for instance, social control was not as heavily funded as in the past, but particularly social security and welfare and education. So the things that people really want and really need in China still very much. China is still a poor country in many places. These things were scaled back again, and that has led to quite a bit of social friction in Chinese society that they currently now have to address. They're now in a situation that the economic growth targets have been met, and now they have to reboot and rethink and focus the money and focus their attention now on the social goals. Anyway, so the point here is that China is controlled by the Communist Party, but the Communist Party does not want to be in full control. But it also has decided 20 years ago, and particularly Xi Jinping, that the degree of control they had was insufficient. And Xi Jinping he likes sort of dramatic statements. So we're saying that, you know, the era of Hu Jintao, his predecessor, was 10 lost years, and the Chinese Communist Party was at the brink of a political crisis, which was complete nonsense. But he said it with such conviction and also a lot of power to back it up, that people accepted it in the party. The party itself also became, and this is very important really, even more than under Hu Jintao, Xi Jinping focused on the party itself. So much of his work, much of his attention, much of his political and financial capital was spent on strengthening the party itself. The number of people that are members of it, but in particular the political discipline of these people, the orthodoxy, the ideological orthodoxy, their training, as I said, their discipline and their party spirit. Lots of money was thrown at that to make the party much more of a disciplined organization. And of course, one of the key things about this was fighting corruption. But fighting corruption is a matter of party discipline in China. But it's only one aspect of party discipline. Other things are just as important. I mean, party discipline also means that you do what the center tells you, or what your boss tells you. That's also party discipline. So the party decides, and after the party has decided, you as a party member or as a party secretary have to faithfully then do what the party has decided. If you don't, then you're in breach of this party discipline, and you can get punished, and you will get punished. But corruption is the thing that people saw most. It also that was the thing that Xi Jinping asked for most attention for, and got that. He was also extremely successful in fighting corruption, without actually fighting the root causes of corruption. He was simply fighting what happened. So the corrupt individuals were attacked without looking at why they were actually corrupt and how they could become corrupt. But he managed to, already by 2016 or 17, to have persecuted more than 100,000 corrupt officials, both as the term is, both flies and tigers, or tigers and flies. So big corruption, big corrupt individuals and small ones. 100,000 of them were persecuted. Most of them were subject to disciplinary measures within the party, but in serious cases they would also then get persecuted in the in the formal judicial sense, and many of these people then ended up in jail or on house arrest, and some of them actually were executed. So being corrupt in China is a high-risk business, let's put it this way, because you may end up dead if you're not very careful. But the flip side of this is really important, is that Xi Jinping, in this way, has made a fantastic number of enemies. When you persecute the 100,000 most important people in the country, you not just alienated 100,000 really important and powerful people, you're alienating their family and their friends, who are also really important and really powerful. So you end up with a colossal number of enemies, right, across the whole party and state and apparatus and across the army. So this means that as Xi Jinping becomes more and more successful in fighting corruption, he's also becoming politically much more, he has to become politically much more paranoid, because there are always people out there to get him. This is the famous problem of the dictator. You know, the dictator fights of his competition and his enemies, but by doing so makes new enemies, so he has to fight even harder, and before he knows it, there's nobody left around him and he's standing all alone. And this is a little bit what Xi Jinping is now facing. In his first term of office, he had a team, let's call it a team, the Politburo and the Central Committee, that consisted of very important leaders of all different stripes, so all different factional allegiances or political convictions, because Xi Jinping at that time was a compromise candidate of different groupings within the party. So he had to accommodate that, and in his leading team, there were all kinds of different people. In the first 5 years in office, he spent basically getting rid of most of them. And what remained in 2017, when he came up for re-election or reappointment, was a bunch of lackeys, essentially people in the second team, the second administration of Xi Jinping. You get a completely different Politburo with only Xi Jinping supporters, people that he had handpicked or people that had allied themselves with him, sort of abandoned their original protector or their patron or their faction, and had joined Xi Jinping because they saw where the money was, saw where the power was. So now we're having a leadership team that only consists of people that really agree with Xi Jinping because it's in their best interest. And that is, again, quite a dangerous situation because there's nobody that talks back, right? And the people that can talk back are in jail or dead, or perhaps they may have fled China. So that leads to a tunnel vision where you can only go straight ahead and only continue doing what you have already done, but then more of it, and more of it, and more of it. So any kind of resistance or opposition, or people that simply argue with you, is seen as disloyalty, is seen as a threat, is seen as something that has to be suppressed. And this is the kind of situation that Xi Jinping is currently facing without, I think, really knowing that he does. And this is not an argument for saying, well, Xi Jinping must come to an end. It's, it's all coming to naught. I don't think so. We're not there yet, but there is definitely a risk, particularly if he gets elected to a third term next year, which is a near certainty. If he then also continues to narrow his political base, I think he might be in for some real problems in the longer term, saying 2 or 3, 4 years from now, because the number of enemies that he'll have, the number of people that just don't agree with him, or the people that have been completely silenced and can no longer participate, will only increase, and the foundation of his power will get less and less. But of course, he has another several trump cards to play, which also explain why he's so successful and so powerful, and that he's been the one leader in China that has made China proud. Ask any Chinese in the Netherlands, particularly people with a little bit of education, and they will say that Xi Jinping, such a guy, He's powerful, he's strong, he's committed, he knows what he wants, and he makes me proud to be Chinese again. And that is the key thing about Xi Jinping. Xi Jinping has made Chinese proud of being Chinese again, because China has risen. China has come to the center of the world stage. China is now becoming perhaps a superpower. And that makes people proud across China. That gives him a huge support. That also means that he has to, and he has done that actually quite successfully, change the basis of his claims to power from being just the leader of the party to being the leader of the whole nation. So, and he does that very cleverly by essentially saying that the party and the nation are the same thing. When you look at, as I unfortunately have to do, look at political propaganda or policy documents from the party, then you see that party and nation are now being conflated. And the party is the nation is the party. And if you're disloyal to the nation or disloyal to the party, you're disloyal to the nation. And that is even exported abroad. The Chinese Communist Party is now actively working amongst overseas Chinese communities in this country, but also in other countries, to align them with the broad nationalist agenda and nationalist goals of China, and with that also of the Communist Party. It hasn't gotten a lot of bite yet, but all the props are in place for this to become more serious in the future. But the point is that most people go along with this quite voluntarily because they see the logic of making China strong again, and when you make China strong again, you as a Chinese are also strong. That feeling is very, very prevalent. And Xi Jinping has tapped into that very, very effectively, much more effectively than his predecessor, who began to try to do the same thing, but Xi Jinping is just much more clever about it. It has also a little bit to do with his emphasis on, which is really strange when you think about it, on Chinese culture, sort of China's excellent culture. China is a civilization, it's not just a country. He says China is an excellent culture, and a culture that is an example for the rest of the world, that can provide things for the world, for the world to learn from, just like the West always claims that they can tell the world how it's like and what they should do. China has its own culture, its own excellent culture, both traditional and modern, and the world should benefit, will benefit from that. So he's taking on the West. And that is, I think, why we're pissed off with him most in the West, because he's telling us, you've been dominating the world for centuries. You've been telling other cultures what to do and what not to do, what to think and what not to think, what is proper progression, what is proper civilization, human rights, democracy, corporate social responsibility, name it, all these things are Western inventions. And we now, as Chinese, will show you that that's just one model, and we have another model. Yeah, and it's just as good, perhaps it's even better. But let people in the world pick and choose what they want. That's what he says. And that's, of course, also a powerful message, right? But we in the West don't like that, because we still think, deep down in our hearts, that Western superiority is real and should be maintained. And that's why we get so angry about China, because it's calling Western bluff. Right, finally. So that's also a point that made me extremely unpopular when I was in Germany, by the way. I said this out in the open, and they didn't really take to that too much, quite honestly. They thought it was a little overstated. So that brings me then to China in the world. So China in the world, what is it that China really wants? What is it that the Chinese Communist Party really wants? What is it that Xi Jinping really wants? The most important thing is that Xi Jinping and China and the Chinese Communist Party do not want to conquer the world, right? This is not Nazi Germany, as some people are now saying. There are certain elements about the Communist Party and about Xi Jinping that resemble Nazi Germany. I will not deny that, and they are serious and very important. But the key difference between them and fascism, to put it bluntly, is that they don't have this idea that China should conquer the world and make the world safe for Chinese to be in and to dominate. He doesn't want that, and he genuinely doesn't want. The Communist Party genuinely doesn't want that. So yes, they have a model, they say, and it's a different model, but they're not out there to impose that on everybody. They're also not out there to conquer countries. In fact, no superpower conquers countries anymore. That's sort of passé. You did that in the 19th and beginning of the 20th century, but we no longer do that. And China is no exception. China doesn't want to conquer. What China wants is the room, not the Lebensraum, but the room for its own economy and its own civilization and its own people to be in the world. So China wants to be part of the world and wants to, yes, to a certain extent also set the terms in which that happens. But it is perfectly happy to allow other people to participate in that, have their own views, or to draw on other sources if they want to. But China really wants to be taken seriously and wants to be able to defend its interests wherever they are in the world. And that makes China the beginning of a superpower. Because superpowers are different from old-fashioned powers in that they see interests everywhere in the world. Because, and this is the other key thing, a superpower competes with another superpower, at least one. Right? So whatever happens in the world is always framed in terms of, oh, this is serving the interests of the other superpower, so we better, invade Afghanistan or invade Vietnam or do whatever crazy things, because otherwise, the other superpower will defeat us, and we will no longer exist as a power, as a country, as a civilization. So superpowers, and that is the real problem at the moment, what we're facing, see competition of power in terms of absolute black and white, an absolute as existential threats. And what we've been doing is to look at China's expansion and China's Belt and Road initiatives and Confucius Institutes and Chinese influences everywhere in the world, and we are framing that in terms of superpower competition, in terms of systemic rivalry. That's the word used by the European Commission. They coined that, or at least two people in the European Commission who should be, I think, I shan't say that. But anyway, there's two people in the European Commission who came up with this wonderful term, systemic rivalry, and almost the rest is history, because the Chinese then took to that and said, what systemic rivalry? We'll show you some systemic rivalry. And then before we knew it, actually, we had America and China fighting each other in terms of, yes, a superpower conflict, systemic rivalry. If you say systemic rivalry, you mean one system must go, or one system must win and the other one must lose. This is not a rivalry between countries with different systems. It's a rivalry between different systems, and that's what you're saying. And China took that message, understood that message, and is, paying us back in kind at the moment. But really, when we look at what China wants, it's not really that. It doesn't really want to impose its system upon us. In fact, we are more guilty, I think, of imposing our system on them than the other way around. Much more guilty because we have no qualms about it at all. But what China really wants, for instance, in Europe, is to be a big player, an important player, so that its market, its exports, its investments, its companies, and its people can fully profit from the markets and the industries and the advanced technologies that we have here. So that is what they want. And sometimes that is to our advantage, and we should work with that. Sometimes it's not, and we should resist it. But we should not resist it sort of as a matter of principle. We should look at, what is it that China wants? Is this something that we can live with? Or is it something that is to our benefit as well? Or is it not? So don't pull it into this absolute systemic rivalry framework, because then you lose sight of interests. China also wants, of course, very, very important in Europe, to split Europe off from the Atlantic Alliance. That is their big goal, right? Because their eyes are really on Washington. They are interested in the US. And Europe is just a prop, or is just part of that game. So what they want is, what they really would like to happen, is Europe to drift away from the United States. Now, they have learned that they can't really then entice the Europeans to come to China's side. They've learned that that doesn't work. The Europeans won't want that. They like America too much, or they fear the Chinese too much. But at least they want to ensure that there is more daylight across the Atlantic. Let's put it this way. And that is an important strategic goal that sometimes they're successful at pursuing, and sometimes actually quite not. And they actually manage to chase Europe and America into each other's arms again, despite the best efforts of the Americans to achieve the opposite sometimes, you think. So that is what China wants. China also wants a divided Europe. It wants a weak Europe that is divided, but not so divided that the EU breaks up. So they want different opinions and different interests to play out to the full in Europe, but the EU as a player is useful to them because it creates a unified market. It creates also something to talk to, which is unified. So in that sense, it's useful. To them, it's also still the idea, if you have a weak but united Europe, then that is still a little bit of a counterweight to the United States. So they rather have that than just a collection of independent states that constantly quarrel with each other. So that is really the game they're playing. But also, very importantly, they want to, and this is something that violates to a certain extent what I've been saying all along, they want to ensure that the Chinese presence abroad, including in Europe, but not limited to Europe, is tied much more firmly into the Chinese nation, but also in the party's, as they call it, system. So they want to ensure that China abroad, so globalized China, which is getting larger every day, naturally getting larger every day, it just happens. Companies invest or buy local companies, Chinese emigrate, or Chinese study abroad. Diplomats are traveling back and forth. Chinese goods are everywhere, Chinese culture products even, of course. China's influence in the cyber domain is getting ever larger. All of that is happening, but what they want is to tie that better into the strategic aims that Xi Jinping and his team have thought up. And that really determines what is happening in terms of policy making just under the radar, right? It's not the formal diplomacy that so much is informed by this, but under the radar, they are very active in doing so. Now, there are a couple of elements to this. The ones that we constantly get warned about by think tanks in Australia and New Zealand and in America and also in Europe now, is that of Chinese interference and Chinese influence. And that's actually small beer. It's not that important. When you look at the actual extent of Chinese influence over politics or the media or universities or public opinion in, let's broadly call them democratic countries, then it's very, very small. And what they do is very clumsy quite often and is easily ferreted out. But it's blown up to be this major thing because it's very useful in a context of an escalating US-China conflict that becomes a Western-China conflict. So this then becomes, as it were, a yardstick or a sort of exhibit number one, as it were, in why we should all align against China. So it's not really that important. Also, the main objective here is not so much to influence our politics or our society, but rather to get a better grip of the Chinese and Chinese presence abroad. That is really what they want. So they want the overseas Chinese, wherever they are, to become truly patriotic Chinese that are aligned with a nation, that are part of an extraterritorial nation, really, that is dominated and controlled by the party. That's what they want, right? So they're not really interested in all these white faces or black faces. They're interested in the Chinese faces. That's what they really are interested in. The second thing they're interested in, and this is not talked about at all in the influencing and interference debate, but I've done a lot of research on, and that is that the party itself is extending its organization abroad. So the party, as I said earlier, in China works through its members, and these members are organized in committees, and these committees you find, and these members you find in any organization in China. What is happening increasingly, actually already for about 12 or 13 years, is that the party is also setting up party committees, or branches as they're usually called, in Chinese companies and other organizations abroad. So when you have a big bank that has an office, let's say in Rotterdam, a Chinese bank with an office in Rotterdam, then that office will have a party branch of the party members amongst the employees of this office. And that committee is linked up with the party committee of the embassy here in the Netherlands and with the party committee of the mother company back home, the main bank in China. And this organizational structure is now, in the last 5-6 years, is really being fleshed out. Europe is not that important in that, I can tell you, I can assure you, because they know they're fighting against the current here, because it's suspicious here in Europe. So it's probably not a good idea to focus a lot of energy on this, but you see it a lot in genuine Belt and Road countries, particularly in Africa, Southeast Asia and Central Asia, where these party committees are beginning to be very well developed, particularly if they are part of a large Chinese multinational or very large Chinese bank. And there's a whole slew of policies that have come through to encourage this and try to tie to extend the grip of the party abroad, not amongst us, not amongst the real foreigners, right, but amongst the Chinese abroad who happen to be party members. So these are all people that are temporarily from China, right? They go back to China because they've been posted abroad to work or to study. So the idea is you tie them back into the system back home in order to not to lose them. You don't want to lose them to foreign influences. You don't want them to yield or give in or to succumb to the sugar-coated bullets of the bourgeoisie or Western lifestyles. That's actual phraseology that is being used. You want them to stay proper Communist Party members and cadres that return to China fully immersed in what the Chinese Communist Party does and wants and will continue to do. And that is their main objective. So what they are creating, both amongst the genuine overseas Chinese, through overseas Chinese policies and influencing policies, and through party building abroad, is to get a stronger grip on China abroad, on global China. So what I'm saying really is that China has globalized over the last 25, 30 years, but with it, the party has globalized. Not to control foreign countries, but to control global China wherever it may go. Now, that's not necessarily a threat, but it's definitely something you have to watch out for, because you never know how far this will extend. So what I think in terms of what we should do is not so much say this is forbidden, this is illegal, this is a communist conspiracy that we have to fight at all costs, but rather we have to force them to come out in the open. And if they don't declare party activities or party membership or party documents to us when they are abroad, then yes, they should be banned. But they should get the opportunity to work if it suits their own domestic purpose, i.e. tying people back into the system. That is fine as far as I'm concerned, but not if they use it to then get greater influence in foreign countries. And that's a little tough, actually, politically to sell in a country like the Netherlands, I would imagine, because the knee-jerk reaction is, kick them all out. If they're Communist Party members and if they're Communist Party activities, forbid it, and if they don't want to stop, then just kick them out. That is the easy answer, but that won't work, because they will simply find other ways to do the same thing, and they will continue to do it only just in secret, right? They in fact do it already in secret, but they're a bit clumsy about it, so that's why it's for people like me really easy to figure out what they're doing. But they will simply get smarter, and they will continue to do it. So that's not really the answer. So we have to find ways of dealing with the Communist Party as a global force without fully antagonizing, but also without being naive and saying, well, it's all fine, sure, go ahead, no problem, we're happy with that. Right? That middle ground is really hard to find in this particular area of policy making, but also, of course, in other things that I've talked about earlier, in terms of economic policy making, trade policy making. Cybersecurity is an important one as well. We have to be much more alert about what it is we want, what is it we don't want, and communicate that clearly, and also be not shy in actually enforcing things by doing things that the Chinese don't like, right? Even if it costs us a little bit at times. And that's where I would like to stop.
Thank you very much, Professor Pieke. Maybe I can ask to put on the lights so we can see each other. Thank you very much. First question, I was thinking, we are here now with a lot of students, with the academic community. Is something like this possible in China? Or maybe talking about a little bit broader, how is there an open or a public discussion or discourse in China?
You do have discussions in China. Of course, in the 1990s and 2000, they were much freer than they are now, and the degrees of freedom have been strongly restricted, both within the party and outside the party, academic world, in the media, in also the social media, for instance. But there's still a lot of debate. The problem with discussions and debates in China is that it never is just a debate. It's never really, you say this, and she says that, and we don't agree, that's fine, but let's see how the arguments pan out. Everything is always political, right? You cannot take a stance about anything without people saying, okay, she or he is really a supporter of this particular powerful individual in the Communist Party, or he or she is really out to undermine the system, or actually he or she is out there to support the system in all costs, right? So everything is always political. So you can't have a discussion saying, this is the problem, there are 3 different ways of dealing with it, what are the arguments for this one, for that one, and that one. You can only have that in a context within the party at the highest levels. And even there, there have been discussions taking place about very important political decisions that have been made. And people that were asked to take a particular position and then did, were subsequently punished because they did so. So even there you have to be very, very careful, right? If you are invited to, I won't be, but if you're invited to come to a study session of the Politburo, which is takes place usually every month or so on a particular topic, you got to be very careful about what you say and what you don't say. You can't shoot off your mouth, right? But you're also expected to explore things that are a little unusual. That's fine, right? And that is the real art of politics in China, seeing where the red lines are, as the Chinese say, right? Where the tripwires are really located, and try to stay within them or push against them a little bit, so that they may move up a little bit, right? That is always the game in China. But never really rush headlong into them, because then you are probably, you're probably not going to live very long, or at least not politically live very long.
And this is also true for academics.
Academics, it's, academic freedom in China has been really severely curtailed under Xi Jinping, particularly in the last 4 or 5 years. So the first few years of Xi Jinping, people said, well, there's nothing really changed, because they know what the difference is between political discussions and academic discussions, and if you discuss things academically in your publications or in your research reports, that's fine, that's how it is. That is beginning to change, not so much about what you say, but rather the topics that you do research on. So certain topics are now being banned. And I have one good example of a former PhD student of mine who's now in a major university in China, and he got phone calls from 3 different departments, let's call them departments of national security, in 3 different provinces, saying, you did research on this, and that's not really possible anymore. You shouldn't do that. Because it's on the website, and we don't want it on the website. We don't want these things to be said by Chinese for everybody to read, both in China and outside of China. The weird thing about it, and that's also really Chinese, that he got this phone call 3 times from 3 different people working through 3 different provinces. And that shows you how inefficient and decentralized the political system in China quite often still is. But it's no joke, right? I mean, he had to stop this. Actually, he had already moved into other research areas, but he had to ask me to take his PhD thesis offline. And I said, we're not going to do that. We have academic freedom here, and that's just too bad, but it's going to stay. No, it's not.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for your talk. I found it very interesting, especially also like how you explained what you think China's motives are in their foreign policy, because it's true, you read so much about like the road initiative, like how threatening that is and expansive in a sense. So thank you for that. But I was curious whether you could tell us just a little bit, I mean, it's difficult to do it in a short time, but like about the treatment of their own people in China. Like I've just been thinking about like how is it when they would try to demonstrate? Could something like the Tiananmen massacre happen again if there would be such an uprising? What is it with the social credits? Like how much are there also in surveillance in the social media? And also you mentioned that the social welfare, it's sort of attention to that is lagging behind compared to the economic growth. So yeah, if you could say something about that.
Oh, that's a whole bucket of questions. Okay, well, the first thing I probably should say is that we should not buy into the stereotype that China is a totalitarian society where there's absolutely no freedom. China is still a very free society for most things that you want to do in China. You can live your life, you can live where you want, get the job you want, send your children to the university or school you want, you can buy the things you want, and that hasn't changed, right? That is one of the key achievements of the reforms. That the party doesn't bother with trying to control your life in this sense. But of course, if you venture into areas that are more political, then yes, you have a problem. And one of the things that Xi Jinping has done much more effectively than his predecessors is crack down on demonstrations, on social disorder. I personally have always found that, and I continue to find this, a misreading of what protest is in China, because then they say, you know, there have been 100,000 incidents of social protest in the last 9 months or something like that. Then you think, my God, you know, the whole thing is going to collapse. But these are people saying, you know, we don't like that this factory is being built here. We want to have a pay raise, or you know, whatever. So these are small issues, right, that people demonstrate for, or fight for, or take action against. They may also try to fight the corruption of individual cadres, or wrongdoings that are happening by individual government agencies and things like that. And that is not disorder, that's healthy, right? That's what you want. That's a political system that's actually finding its feet. But the Communist Party has deliberately and consistently misread it as systemic and aimed at against the stability of the regime. And I think that is where they made a big mistake, quite honestly. So they've imagined an enemy that didn't exist. So they have put an enormous amount of effort from particularly 2005-06 into making demonstrations much more difficult. The use of the so-called petitioning system, that I won't explain that because it's difficult, has been restricted. People demonstrate or go to Beijing to demonstrate in front of the emperor. That's no longer allowed, and so on and so forth. All these things have been taken, and particularly they've thrown an enormous amount of money at it. So they started with social stability funds that are very, very heavily funded. But actually, when you look at how these funds are being used, they're not used to buy guns or something like that, or buy or build new jails, but they're used to pay off people who go on strike, or people who demonstrate. So it becomes then a way of saying, okay, you want to organize a strike, how much does it take for you to stay home? And then they negotiate. So it becomes a way of fleecing the government, right? So then it becomes very Chinese, I think, because it's never really quite what you think it is. This is about money, and the government is spending money, so people are very happy to take it. And in this way, they buy social stability. Now, that was the high tide of this kind of use of social stability funds was the Hu Jintao era. Under Xi Jinping, it's gotten a little bit more serious. So the discourse of national security and public order has been reinforced now, looking more at issues of what was called social management. Social management started with this idea, and it started already in 2006, that society is autonomous. Very great idea, right? Society is autonomous. So we need to find ways, organized ways, regular ways for society to govern itself. So for neighborhoods to govern how the neighborhood is run, how particular rules are set and then enforced. We give a greater role to NGO-type social organizations in rolling out government policy, for instance. This was all part of the social management agenda. And in itself, that was a great idea. So you have the party that sits on top, but lets the actual running of society, not so much to the government anymore, but to all kinds of civil organizations and social organizations that govern themselves. And that, I thought, was a very sort of, was a clever idea, but it then deteriorated under Xi Jinping in social governance. And then the government itself started invading this, started reigning these social organizations, so these NGO-type organizations, consumer organizations, or house owner organizations, reigning them in much more and much more telling them what to do and how to do it, and reducing the degree of freedom that they had. And then after 2016, they started actually imposing the social credit system on top of that. Social credit system was originally was a mechanism of social management. And then it became more, but also less, by the way. Because social credit system you can give a whole lecture on, but it's not what we think it is. I mean, it started out with this big idea, right, that everybody is accountable for what they do, and if you do the wrong things persistently and consistently, then you get penalized because your freedoms are taken away. Now, that grand ambition has actually been disbanded, and what they do now is use the social credit system for much more limited purposes in specific areas. for specific policies or specific goals. And the idea of having sort of a fully managed society through social credit, they're actually moving away from that because they see that that is unmanageable, and it will not yield the results that they really want, and they've raised the bar a little bit. So in that sense, they're doing things that I would find more acceptable or more rational, as it were. Yeah. And I'm not going to talk about Uyghurs, if you don't mind. I'm not talking about the Uyghurs, because we can also talk about religious freedoms. We can talk about ethnicities. That's a different topic.
It's not the Uyghurs. Hi there. Obviously, again, thanks for coming. It was great. You mentioned in your speech about the Communist Party's plan to change or mold China's role internationally. I was wondering if you could go a little more into how their participation and hosting of large-scale sort of like international cultural events, the Olympics, things like that, play a role within that plan.
The Olympics, of course, was crucial, because the Olympics was really when China, as an international player, fundamentally changed its shape. This was the height of China, the cuddly China, the player of the international game, a member of the international community that wanted to be part of that community, wanted to be part of the world, and the Olympics was sort of the symbolic culmination of that. And after that, you see China moving away, say, okay, we have now achieved full sort of membership status, but we want to have more. So you see China getting more aggressive when it comes to issues like the South China Sea, Senkaku Islands and all that, and then things started deteriorating, at least from our perspective. They're getting more ballsy, they're getting more aggressive, they're getting more interested in their own international agenda rather than trying to play nice and be part of the system. They now want to set the tone of the system. They want to set the shape of the system. And they wanted to be shaped also to suit their priorities and their ways of doing things. And they're becoming very, very good at that. You probably know just as well as I do that the United Nations has become almost a tool of the Chinese government. They are really, really good at using the United Nations for their own purposes. The UNESCO, for instance, is essentially under their control, and a bunch of others as well, of UN organizations. They are able to impose Chinese propaganda terms onto UN documents. So in that sense, they are no longer interested in simply playing the game of the established order. They now want to shape the order. And the question really is, is that illegitimate? Is that bad? Or is this a natural thing with the world changing and other countries, not just China, but other countries rising and saying, this is our world too, and the United Nations and international law and all these other aspects of the international order, they've been made by Western powers. You can say that it wasn't, but it is. And now we want to shape things according to what we think is important and what we want to happen. I personally think that there's a little bit of both, right? Because the Chinese make that argument, and that's a valid argument, but they use it only to serve their interests and their objectives, and not those of a broader constituency, as far as I can see. They're giving a certain voice to, yes, poor African countries, they say, but really they're just, promoting their own agenda. So in that sense, I don't think they're going to be necessarily better than what we did. They may even be worse, quite honestly. So there's a little bit of hypocrisy there, quite a bit of that hypocrisy there as well. But despite that, I think the argument in itself is valid. We have to accommodate rising powers like China without giving away the family jewels, of course. But we can't say, the order as it was sort of devised over the last decades after the Second World War, that is written in stone, is holy, is sacred, that can never change. Because the world has changed, and the West is no longer the only important player here. It's a very important and still dominant player, but it's not the only one anymore. And we have to sort of realize this and accommodate that.
My question is, since China has this trade surplus and it uses it mostly for foreign direct investment in the African continent, and with your comment about China not conquering other territories, is it, I know it's not a physical conquest, but when we have this foreign direct investment in African continents or in countries such as Hong Kong and Taiwan that have a political diplomacy with China that is in conflict, how are those not examples of conquering, like China trying to conquer other territories?
From a perspective of the Chinese Communist Party, Taiwan and Hong Kong are not different countries. They are part of China. So the way they're dealing with Hong Kong and Taiwan is not an international issue. It's a domestic issue. And the fact that we don't like the way they deal with it, I don't like the way they deal with Hong Kong, I don't like the way they deal with Taiwan, but the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government says, well, that's none of your business, right? This is our internal issue, and that has no bearing on our international relations. So they see this simply as part of the ongoing project of making China whole. That's still not completed, right? In fact, you could make the argument that, and I want to make the argument, that what they do in Hong Kong, when you compare to what it should be compared to, namely Tiananmen in 1989, they're doing a very clever job. And they've avoided bloodshed to a very large extent. And they have not sent in the army like they had in 1989. And I think that is because they realize what can happen if you send in the army and you use a full boot of military force. They will never want to do that again. So in that sense, they have learned. Nevertheless, they say, this is not your problem. This is not something you should involve yourself in. This is our problem. Whether you buy that argument is not a matter, but that's what they say. In Africa, yes, the Chinese investment is very large. The flow of investment is very large, but the total assets, invested assets of America and Europe are still much larger in Africa than and I think even Japanese assets are still larger than the Chinese ones. So the Chinese, like elsewhere in the world, are still catching up, right? The Chinese are investing very heavily, but because they have been doing it for a relatively short period of time, let's say 10, 15 years, there's still a lot of catching up for them to do. So Africa is still, let's say, very much an arena for competition between different players. And these are, of course, European countries and the EU, there's America, there's Japan, but there's also India, right? That also is getting into Africa and is starting to invest, particularly in West Africa and in Southern Africa, for that matter. So Africa is sadly becoming again an arena of great power politics, like it was in the 19th century. China's objectives in Africa are not conquest. They are there for markets, for access to raw materials, and also very important influence over governments for United Nations purposes. They want these governments to be aligned with the Chinese position internationally so that they can use that to their advantage. Those are their main objectives. And when you look at it up close, like many people have done now, is that you see that African governments are very actively involved in this whole process. It's not simply the Chinese imposing themselves. It may have looked like that in the early 2000s, but actually what is happening now is that governments in Africa and also African investors themselves are involved in how the Chinese investments pan out, for what projects they're being used, what the terms are for these investments, what are the interest rates for the loans and all that. Sort of the keyword that's being used is African agency. And you see that African governments are very, very clever. African elites more broadly have become very clever in also using the Chinese for their own advantage and their own purposes. So they're playing off the Europeans and the Chinese quite often to see how they can maximize their own benefits. So it isn't as simple as it looks, right? There's great power competition taking place, Africa as an arena, and the Chinese having to deal with African elites, because in the beginning they were pretty stupid and ham-fisted, and they thought they could simply call the shots and roll things out the way they wanted. That didn't work so well, didn't go very well at all, particularly in a country like Zambia, for instance, and they had to play a much more clever game, and they're now very, very good at that. But the Africans are very good at it as well. They've learned.
Another question?
Hello. First, thanks for the speech. I would like to ask you, what is your opinion on what the European Union's course of action should be? As you said, we have the proclaimed systemic rivalry, but what should our course of action be in response to Chinese action in Europe, specifically in Eastern and Southeastern Europe, mainly Serbia, Montenegro, and the Balkans for like a region?
I think the key thing is that when you ask this to people in Brussels, but also in the main European countries in Western Europe, then they all say, you know, we need greater European unity. But that means that the way that France or Germany or Holland, for that matter, perceive China should dominate. Whereas in Eastern Europe, they quite often see it a little different. So if you say we need unity in Europe vis-à-vis China, then it just means Western Europe imposing its agenda on Eastern Europe, or Southern Europe for that matter. And that's why you get a lot of pushback in Eastern Europe, because they say, well, you know, we don't want to be treated like sort of the stepchild that has to go along with whatever mommy and daddy say. We want to make our own China policies, and they have done that. That was the attractiveness of the 16+1 to many of these countries, although that attractiveness has now worn a little thin quite often for many. But going their own way was a way of also gaining more leeway and more autonomy vis-à-vis Brussels for them. And when you look at the way they talked about this, China was a way of putting up the middle finger to Brussels, or to gain more leverage vis-à-vis Brussels, to set their own policies vis-à-vis China. That, I think, is perfectly legitimate, quite honestly. I'm not saying that all the choices they made were necessarily all that great, but you can't deny them that kind of agency again. Again, the word agency, sorry. And what we really have to do is saying, instead of we need unity, we've got to say, okay, unity for whom? Which interests are we really interested in catering? Which are the really key interests? Are they the key interests of those of I don't know, German big industry, or the strategic interests of the EU as a global player? Are we interested in infrastructural investment in Eastern and Southern Europe? You know, what is it that we want? Are we interested in markets, or in technology transfer? You know, what is it that we really want? And then I think we need a discussion, and that's the problem also in Holland actually. We need a discussion about what it is that we want from China, and also what it is we don't want, and then try to horse trade with each other. We have to be a little rough and dirty about this. What is it that you want from China and don't want? What is it that you want and don't want? And how can we find some kind of compromise, democracies, right? Compromise that we both are not very happy with, but not so unhappy that we walk away from it. And then we, you know, once we have found that kind of unity, dirty as it may be and imperfect as it may be, only then can you start negotiating with the Chinese. Because if you leave these issues unresolved, then the Chinese will simply play one off against the other, which is what they've been doing, right? So we need a discussion, and not only a discussion, but also decisions about what is it that we really want, what is it that we absolutely don't want, and then put the mechanism in place to make that happen. And that involves the whole spectrum of policy areas like technology transfer, cybersecurity, geopolitical issues, even investment, trade, and so on and so forth. And human rights, as if you really want to, can also add to the mix, although I'd prefer not to.
So, as everybody already said, thank you for the lecture. I do want to ask 2 questions, if that's okay.
I'm not the chair.
So the first one, could you slightly touch upon China's stance upon climate change and combating it, and what your views on that are? And then secondly, you mentioned during your lecture about the Communist Party letting down restrictions, opening up markets, and that bringing forth economic growth. Would you say this is like the same but the opposite of European countries adapting more social policies, but then in this case a communist country adopting more capitalist economic policies?
The great convergence, right? In a weird way. First about climate change. the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government is genuinely serious about climate change. When you look at how policy has developed since particularly that 2015-16, and actually looked at that, then you see that climate change started out as just a token issue, and a way of sort of scoring some easy points in the diplomatic tussle with other big countries, to deflect criticism of China in other areas. But it has become a really important issue politically. It is a key priority in the current 5-year plan. They're putting real money to it, and they got a package of policy measures to try to give that bite. It's also something that amongst the Chinese population is an issue of great concern. And despite the fact that people think that in a non-democratic society public opinion doesn't matter, it really does matter to the Communist Party. And they keep a very close tab on what the public wants and doesn't want. They do all kinds of surveys and opinion polls, and of course they monitor social media very, very closely to try to stay in touch with what the population may want or not want and who wants what. And climate change is a key thing. So it is a priority. The question is, are they doing enough, or could they do more? And the question about climate change is always, no, it's never enough, and you can always do more. Yeah, of course they could do more. We could also do more. Should we do more is another question, by the way. That is not something I have any expertise on, although I have an opinion, but that doesn't matter, my opinion. So the Chinese are committed to it. They need to be committed to it, for pretty much the same reason as governments in Western countries are committed to it, right? Because the population wants it, because it is constructed now as a key challenge for the 21st century that nobody can get around anymore. So in that sense, they are broadly aligned with what we want. But I think they would do this, the Chinese would do the same thing as any country would do, is trying to blame others for not doing enough and saying how much you do yourself, and then making the other people do even more while you do less. That is a normal part of diplomatic relations, unfortunately. And this is how it goes. Then about markets, yes, there are several words for that. Some people call it market Leninism. I've called it neo-socialism. And what it really means is that a market economy, which is bustling and free and growing and expanding all the time, coincides and coexists very well with a Leninist political system. There is no inherent contradiction there, because this is not a matter of principle or ideology, it's about political practicalities. So a liberal policy in the economic area and great sort of social freedoms work perfectly well with an authoritarian political Leninist system, because there is nobody. We live with this idea that economic liberalism and political liberalism are sort of always have to go together. So when you have economic liberalism, this must lead to calls for more democracy from a rising middle class. Now, I think China has simply proven this wrong. There is a middle class, there is economic liberty, there's social liberty as well, to a very large extent, as I explained, and that doesn't lead to more democracy. In fact, it supports these freedoms, and this market economy supports the Leninist system. It gives it more money to play with. The government is expanding, the party is expanding, it can throw money at things that it could never throw at. It uses, actually the Communist Party itself, uses market mechanism within the Communist Party itself. For instance, in the allocation of courses for training high cadres. These are allocated through tender bidding, which is kind of bizarre when you think about it, but the Leninist system is using the market to make Leninism better. So there is no contradiction there at all, and that I also don't see this contradiction emerging, by the way.
Please. No, don't push it, just...
So China is becoming a new world superpower, and I think it's now competing with the United States, and in the future it will be even more competing with the United States. And what I see in Europe as a citizen of the European Union and also as a citizen of the Netherlands, I see. Correct me if I am wrong. I see that some companies for example, in the Netherlands, our ASML, they are like, I think they are forced to stop selling chip machines to China because of the pressure of the Americans. I also see some of our Dutch network providers, such like the Tele2 and KPN and other network providers, but also another network providers in other European nations. They also get a lot of pressures from America. So should we in the Netherlands worry about this kind of phenomenon? And yes, should we worry about the explanation of the power from China? And should we also listen and follow the American rules?
We are not only in the Netherlands, but other European countries as well, and countries also in Asia, even more so I'd say, are not so much subject to Chinese aggression, but we're caught between two superpowers. So one superpower tells us, align with us, and the other superpower says, don't necessarily align with us, but work with us on these areas. And that means that more and more issues are deliberately being weaponized, starting with the Trump administration, of course, but now the Chinese are doing the same thing. So whatever aspects of globalization of your relationship with one or both of the superpowers now becomes a weapon in the hands of the superpowers to damage the other. Hence ASML, right? That had nothing to do with the genuine threat of ASML selling things to China, because ASML was perfectly confident that they would never be able to copy their machines anyway, and I believe them. But it was a way of hurting China. It was an American way of hurting China. And these things are happening more and more. So things are not so much part of what are our interests in our relationships with China, but rather the Americans or the Chinese making us do things because they want to hurt each other. And that, I think, is something that's a bind that we find ourselves in because we don't have the political muscle and the diplomatic and military muscle to do something against it. We are simply too weak. Europe doesn't have an army, really, or not big enough an army, not unified an army command. Europe doesn't have the diplomatic muscle, really, that the Americans and the Chinese have. And we simply are just victimized by these two powers. And that's our own bloody fault, right? We let it happen. So one of the things that we have to do as Europeans is to team up and make Europe genuinely a whole, so that it and put real money into making it a whole and making it a strong power. I'm a European federalist. I make no bones about that. I think that's the only way forward, to be able to maintain this, I hate the word, strategic autonomy of Europe vis-à-vis China and vis-à-vis America. Because if what is now happening in the discussion all over the world really is, we should link up with the Americans because the Chinese are a threat and we need to be part of the American alliance for security reasons. And there is something to that. Yes, we should align with the Americans if and where it suits our purposes. And we should align with the Chinese if and when it serves our purpose at that end, right? But I think the days are gone that we say we are part of the American alliance no matter what. I don't think these days actually ever existed, but people imagine them that they existed. But that's not the way forward, because that means we will forever lose control of our own destiny. If we now say, we're going headlong with the Americans in their conflict with the Chinese, then the Americans will laugh their heads off because they will make a deal with the Chinese anyway, and they leave us out. I can predict that will happen. So if you play with superpowers, you better have the power to pull it off. And if you don't, you're going to be a victim of their competition, which you are now.
Thank you for being here. My question is, we are often told by the media that Chinese people, they accept the authoritarian rule of the Chinese Communist Party because of the economic miracle. But now that that miracle is, and you said that we might have distanced some people in developing countries by trying to impose our system and trying to pose that our system is the best. But now with the Chinese economic miracle slowing down, what are your observations about the general population in China on Western democracy or democracy with Chinese characteristics? And what could be the influence of Chinese students abroad coming back to China?
Yeah, you're asking two different questions actually. First of all, what the Chinese population thinks about the West, and secondly, what happens if and when the Chinese growth model runs out of steam. These are two very different questions. What the Chinese population thinks about the West is very complex. A friend of mine who used to be in Leiden actually, she's now in Berlin at the Hertie School of Business, Dani Stockman. She's done a lot of research on online postings, but then also following it up through questionnaires of people who posted things online about opinions of the West. That made her persona non grata in China. She can't no longer go to China because she was doing stuff that was politically too dangerous. And you see very many different opinions on the West. But on the whole, there's only a minority of people who buy into the CCP's anti-Western rhetoric. Most people still have this idea that the West is not so bad after all, right? That's, it's been upheld as a beacon of modernity and development that China should aspire to, and that still lingers very strongly. People also have connections with Western countries because they've studied there, or because their kids study there, or because they work there, or live there, or because they know Westerners in China. So most people in China have a pretty positive impression still of the West, in different degrees and for different reasons. And the hard line, so the anti-Westerners, which isn't actually even the party line, quite honestly, are a minority. But I think it is also growing, but since she can't do the research anymore, it's difficult to tell. So that's one, and so in that sense, that also means that the Communist Party has to be a little careful about what it does in terms of bashing the West, right? Because there is not necessarily a huge natural constituency for it, unless you package in strongly and starkly patriotic and nationalist and chauvinist terms. We are great, we are strong, and we have to fight. We have to find our own place at an equal level to the West. That is fine, but if you say the West is bad, that's not so fine. And so you have to be careful as Xi Jinping. So then the second question was, what was it again?
What could be the impact of the economic growth slowing down on democracies?
Now, on democracy, it will have no impact. Chinese economic model has been slowing down for the last 10 years, really. And it's been kept going by massive investments from the government, central government to a certain extent, but local governments even more so. And that was done very deliberately and against the advice of many, say, more liberal supply-side economists that you also have in China, although many of them are in jail now. And that is running out of steam. It's also deliberately done because what they wanted is to sustain that growth, or at least a fair amount of growth, until 2021, i.e. this year, because they wanted to say, okay, in 2020 we have met our first centennial goal, and that is becoming a moderately prosperous society. So they did everything they could to maintain the growth model, although they actually knew it was running out of steam. And now they have to pay the piper, because they got this massive amount of debt with the local government and with companies in the private sector and also in the banking system. The central government is fine, of course they're fine, right? They've been able to get rid of the debt or sort of ensure that other people and other governments have taken on the debt. But local governments quite often are doing not so well. And this is now a deliberate strategy of saying, okay, we've now met our target, and now we allow the economy to cool down, go to a much lower degree of growth, percentage of growth, 2, 3, 4, 5% is also good already, in the hope that that will sustain for a long enough period to be able to start paying off these debts, and then hopefully propel China into another type of growth, which they're invested very heavily in as well, which is sort of qualitative growth through by investing in technology, by investing in also in education, higher education in particular, in order to generate a kind of growth that will pull China out of this famous middle income trap that to a certain extent, only to a certain extent, they're caught into. They have a vision, they have an idea about how to do it, but the question is really how deep will the slowdown bite and what will the political consequence of that be? And the key thing is, will this in 2022, so next year with the next party congress, will this generate enough opposition or enough arguments against Xi Jinping to make him actually wobble in his power? That is the real question. I think they're going to be able to pull it off. I'm pretty confident that they're going to be able to pull it off, but it's not a certainty, right? They have taken a very deliberate gamble, and this is sort of crunch time. That's also why everybody is completely crazy and paranoid about the party congress and about party unity and Xi Jinping's leadership. Nothing can happen that even remotely starts challenging Xi Jinping. Every form of opposition or criticism is muffled and made impossible because they know they have a problem, right? As I said earlier, they can't really spend as much money as they really should for social security and welfare and poverty alleviation. They have put the system in place, which is great, but they now don't have the money to pay for it, particularly in the poor parts of China. Because the key thing is that social security and social welfare and poverty alleviation have to be paid for by local governments. So the central government can say, well, it's your problem. We'll give you some money. We'll transfer, a third of what you need, but the other 2/3 you have to find yourself. And that means that poor places get poorer. And rich places are being able to do it, but poor places can't, and they get poorer. And that is the key problem at the moment.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, looking at the time, we have to close the session.
Oh, all right.
I'm sorry. I want to thank you for coming here and especially for your great questions. And I would like to thank Professor Frank Pieke, not only for your great lecture, but also for your very insightful questions. Mm-hmm. So sorry that we have to close, but at that moment, I would like to have one more round of applause for Frank Pieke.